she woke up alone, in labor, in a thunderstorm. But what shattered her soul wasn't the contractions, it was the silence. Her husband was gone, no note, no goodbye, just an empty apartment and an emptier promise. Mara's story isn't just about heartbreak, it's about survival, about holding on to hope when every fiber of her being wanted to give up. And just when she thought it was over, fate placed someone extraordinary in her path. A man who didn't just hold her hand, he held her newborn triplets, and in that quiet morning light he held out a ring. But could she trust again? Could a shattered heart ever truly be whole? Before we dive deep into this extraordinary journey of love lost and love found, tell me in the comments, would you give love another chance after betrayal? Would you marry someone who met you on your worst day? Please, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Someone out there needs to hear this today. Now let's begin. The night Mara went into labor, the rain didn't just fall, it crashed. It was as if the heavens had decided to grieve with her. The storm outside was unrelenting, but inside her modest apartment, a deeper, more devastating storm raged. She paced the worn wooden floor with trembling hands resting on her swollen belly, her breath shallow, sharp. Her hospital bag sat by the door, packed, waiting, but there was no one to carry it, no one to hold her hand, no one to drive her to safety. Derek, her husband, the man who had once promised to be her partner through everything, was gone. Gone without a word, without a fight, without a second thought. Mara had sensed the shift in him for weeks, the way his eyes grew distant, how he avoided looking at the ultrasound photos, the way he stopped brushing her hair back from her face at night. But she never imagined he'd leave, not like this, not now. The apartment echoed with silence, the kind of silence that only abandonment leaves behind, and in that heavy quiet the first contraction hit. She gasped, her hand gripping the back of a chair as pain seared through her abdomen. Sweat dotted her forehead and her knees buckled slightly. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to regain composure, but it was no use. The contractions were coming, fast and closer together. With her phone's battery blinking red, she dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but the nearest ambulance was delayed due to blocked roads and a downed power line. Her mind raced. She had no car, no husband, no family nearby. Another contraction, sharper than the last, made her cry out. She staggered to the window, leaning heavily against it, rain streaking down the glass like the tears she refused to let fall. That's when she saw the headlights. A black sedan, moving cautiously through the flood-soaked street, pulled up to the curb. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating. But when the car door opened and a man stepped out, umbrella in hand, her heart froze. He wasn't Derek. He was tall, wearing a crisp overcoat, and despite the downpour, there was an unmistakable calmness about him. Not indifference, calm, as if chaos didn't scare him, as if pain didn't push him away. He looked up, their eyes meeting through the rain, and then, without hesitation, he walked to her building's entrance and knocked. Mara hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed caution, but her body, torn between the intensity of labor and the desperation for safety, overrode her fear. She opened the door. "I heard someone was in distress," the man said, his voice deep, reassuring, completely unlike the men who make promises they don't keep. "Are you alone?" Mara nodded, a sob catching in her throat as another contraction bent her in half. He didn't flinch, he didn't ask intrusive questions. He simply stepped forward, his arm gently wrapping around her back. "We need to get you somewhere safe." She barely registered the feel of his coat against her cheek as he lifted her into the car. The leather seats were warm, a stark contrast to the cold reality that had consumed her for weeks. As he closed the door behind her and started the engine, she dared to look at him through blurry eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Julian," he replied, eyes fixed on the road, hands steady on the wheel. "I run the foundation downtown. I was on my way back from a late-night visit to one of our shelters when I saw you at the window." She wanted to ask more, but another contraction took over, stealing her breath and replacing it with raw, guttural pain. "Just hold on," Julian said, glancing at her with a calm urgency. "There's a place nearby. It's private, safe. We'll be there soon." The rain pounded harder as the car navigated the dark, flooded streets. Mara's breathing grew erratic. She clenched her fists, crying out again, her body writhing with every surge of pain. Julian reached into the back seat, grabbing a folded blanket and gently placing it over her lap. "You're doing great. Just breathe. You're not alone." They pulled into a quiet driveway bordered by hedges and tall trees. A modest two-story guest house stood at the end of the path, its porch light flickering weakly in the rain. Julian parked under the overhang, leapt out, and came to her side. He carried her through the rain without hesitation, his steps deliberate and swift. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a warmly lit foyer, soft wooden floors, and the smell of lavender. "Welcome to one of our Foundation's properties," he said. "No one else is here right now. You'll be safe." Mara was laid gently on a prepared bed. Within minutes, Julian had called a private midwife he knew through his medical outreach work. Blankets were warmed, a nurse arrived, the room transformed into a haven, a stark contrast to the agony that had brought her here. Labor was unforgiving. Every contraction pushed her to the edge, but somewhere between the waves of pain, Julian sat beside her, not touching, not imposing, but present. His presence alone was a lifeline. He read her breathing cues, offered water, held the bucket when nausea overcame her, and dimmed the lights when her headache peaked. She had met him less than an hour ago, but he treated her pain like it was personal. And in the darkest hour of night, when her strength was nearly gone, her body trembling and tears streaming freely, the cries came. Not one, three newborn voices wailing into the stillness of the guest house. Triplets. Mara collapsed back onto the pillows, drenched in sweat, her face streaked with tears. She didn't even know how to process it. Her husband had left, she had nothing to her name, and now she had 3 tiny lives depending on her. The midwife cleaned the babies and placed them in her arms, one by one. Her arms felt too weak to hold them, her heart too shattered to give them the love they deserved, but their cries, soft, human, real, brought a flicker of light to the wreckage within her. She looked up through a haze of exhaustion and saw Julian standing silently by the doorway, hands folded, eyes soft. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "Don't thank me, just rest." As the storm eased outside, Mara stared at her babies, 3 perfect souls wrapped in warmth, and for the first time in weeks she didn't feel empty. She didn't know who Julian truly was, why he had stopped for her, or what the future held. But in that moment, she understood one thing. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The storm had moved on, leaving behind puddles on the stone path and a quiet calm that settled over the guest house like a sigh of relief. The stillness was fragile, as if it too were trying to heal. Inside, Mara lay beneath soft blankets in a room filled with morning light. Her body ached, her heart felt bruised, and the cries of 3 tiny lives echoed from the nearby nursery. Nurses tiptoed between feedings and diaper changes, and though the space was warm and kind, the silence between each sound felt louder than ever. Julian remained present but not intrusive. He coordinated with staff, made gentle inquiries about her comfort, and brought her warm food she barely touched. He didn't press her for answers or ask about Derek. He simply offered quiet kindness, an antidote to the chaos she had survived. For 3 days, Mara barely spoke. She moved like a ghost in the corridors, her gaze often fixed on nothing. Her heart had not caught up with her body. The trauma of abandonment clung to her, tightening around her throat each time she thought of how Derek had left with not a single word, leaving her to bleed, cry, and give birth alone. But the triplets, Nova, Orion, and Soren, needed her, and so she endured. One rainy afternoon, as the babies napped, Mara stood barefoot on the back porch of the guest house, wrapped in an oversized cardigan. The scent of wet earth drifted through the air. She leaned against the wooden post, eyes scanning the distant trees, her thoughts a tangled web of confusion and fear. Julian joined her, but didn't speak at first. He simply stood nearby, his presence calm and steady, the way sunlight filters through clouds without making a show of it. "You don't have to keep showing up like this," she said softly, not turning toward him. "I'm not your responsibility." Julian's voice was gentle. "I'm not here out of obligation, Mara." She finally glanced at him. "Then why are you here?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because I saw someone who was abandoned at her most vulnerable, and no one deserves to feel alone at a time like that." Mara's jaw tightened. "Plenty of people do. I'm not special." Julian looked at her, and his voice softened further. "You carried life in your body, brought it into this world while battling betrayal, pain, and fear. That's not ordinary. That's strength. Most people never find." His words stirred something deep in her chest. She looked away again, blinking quickly. "Strength doesn't mean I'm okay," she whispered. "I know," Julian replied. "That's why I'm not asking you to be." The wind picked up, sending a cool gust across the porch. Mara pulled the cardigan tighter. Her eyes flicked to him again, softer this time. "Why were you really on that road that night?" Julian's smile was small but sincere. "I just left one of our city shelters. I tend to stop by unannounced, keeps everyone honest. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to take the long route home." Mara's brow furrowed. "Why?" "I didn't know," he admitted. "I just felt pulled. And when I saw you in that window, soaked in moonlight and panic, it was like the universe whispered, 'Stop. Now.'" Silence wrapped around them again, but this time it was shared. Inside the house, one of the triplets began to cry. Mara turned, her shoulders slumping with fatigue. "That's Orion. You can go," Julian offered. "I'll make you tea." She hesitated, surprised by how quickly she'd come to recognize each baby's cry. Then she disappeared inside, her footsteps light but weary. Julian entered the kitchen and set a pot of water on the stove. He moved through the house like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping heart. When Mara returned a few minutes later, Orion pressed gently against her chest in a soft sling. She found a steaming mug of mint tea waiting for her at the kitchen counter. She gave Julian a nod of quiet gratitude. "I didn't know what kind you liked," he said. "This is perfect," she replied. "Thank you." He gestured to the baby. "How's he doing?" "Tired," she said. "They all are. But I think he smiles when I sing." Julian chuckled. "Then he's already smarter than most." That was the first time Mara smiled since the night of the birth. It was small, faint, but it was real, and Julian noticed. That evening, after the babies had been tucked into the cradle together, 3 tiny bodies breathing in synchronized softness, Mara found herself sketching again. Her hand moved slowly, uncertain at first, but with growing purpose. The lines were uneven, shaky, but they took shape. 3 leaves sprouting from the same stem, reaching in different directions but rooted in one origin. Julian passed by the open door and paused. "You're drawing again. It's helping me remember who I was before everything fell apart," she said. "Maybe you're not remembering," he said. "Maybe you're redefining." She looked up at him for a long time, then nodded. The days turned to a week, and slowly the rhythm of life changed. Julian installed a white noise machine in the nursery to help the babies sleep. He stocked the kitchen with groceries. He even brought Mara a used sketchpad he'd found in a bookstore, with a note scribbled inside the cover, "Art heals." So does time. Still, he never pushed, never asked for more than she was willing to give. One afternoon, as Julian rocked Soren to sleep in the nursery while humming a lullaby, Mara stood in the doorway watching him. "I don't understand you," she said, arms crossed. Julian turned with a sleepy Soren nestled on his shoulder. "How so? You're kind, patient, generous. But what do you get out of this?" Julian looked at her, no smile this time, just honesty. "I know what it feels like to lose someone too soon. My younger sister died in childbirth. She was alone. No one was there to hold her hand or tell her she mattered. That guilt, what I didn't do for her, never left me." Mara's breath caught. Julian continued, voice steady despite the heaviness. "When I saw you that night, something inside me said, 'Don't let history repeat.' Maybe I couldn't save her, but maybe I could be there for someone else who needed to be seen." For a moment, neither of them spoke, and then Mara walked into the room. She gently took Soren from his arms and laid him in the crib. Her movements were precise, maternal, strong. When she turned back, her voice was soft. "Thank you, for not asking me to move on before I'm ready." Julian met her gaze with quiet respect. "The only timeline that matters is yours." That night, as Mara sat in bed watching the shadows shift on the ceiling, she realized something profound. She didn't feel afraid, not completely, not anymore. Julian hadn't swept in like some fantasy to fix her world. Instead, he had quietly helped her remember that she had never truly been broken. The pieces were still there, scattered perhaps, but strong, capable, whole. And with each new day, she felt the stirring of something she never thought she'd feel again. Hope. By the 3rd week, Mara found herself lingering in moments she once rushed through. Washing bottles became a kind of meditation. Rocking the triplets to sleep gave her time to reflect instead of escape. And when Julian walked into a room, her eyes lifted instinctively, not with dread or fear, but curiosity. The walls she'd built to protect her heart had not crumbled, but they had begun to soften. Julian never once crossed a line. He remained respectful, even when the lines between support and affection grew hazy. He offered a steady rhythm in the chaos of single motherhood, a presence she had not expected, but had grown to need. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the nursery window and bathed the crib in gold, Julian appeared holding a large wrapped box. "What's this?" Mara asked, brow raised. Baby Nova nestled against her shoulder. He smiled. "It's not much, just something I thought you might enjoy." She hesitated, then unwrapped it slowly, revealing a high-resolution drawing tablet, complete with stylus and design software. Her breath caught. "Julian, I remembered you said you hadn't touched digital design since before." He paused. "Since things changed." Mara traced the stylus with her fingertips, her eyes stinging with emotion. "This is Too much. It's just enough, he replied. You deserve to create again. That afternoon she set it up on a small table near the living room's bay window. She didn't draw immediately, but having it there, ready, waiting, was enough to spark something inside her. A quiet hunger to reclaim not just survival but passion. Over the next few days she began sketching small things, abstract shapes, gentle silhouettes of her babies, and eventually the outline of a woman sitting by a window, staring at the rain. It was her, and yet it wasn't. Julian never hovered, but he always noticed. Each night when the triplets were finally asleep, they would sit on the back porch with warm tea between them. Conversations began to wander into vulnerable terrain, past heartbreaks, strange childhood quirks, silly college regrets. The more Mara shared, the more she realized how long it had been since someone actually listened. One evening, as a soft breeze stirred the trees, Mara asked, "Have you ever been in love?" Julian's gaze didn't flinch. Once. Years ago. What happened? She wanted a man who would chase the world with her. I was too busy trying to save it. Mara nodded slowly. So you stopped chasing? No, he said. I just changed the direction. She looked down into her mug, swirling the last bit of tea. And now, Julian said quietly, I'm not chasing anyone. I'm standing still, and realizing that sometimes the most beautiful things come to you when you're not reaching for them. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It shimmered with something delicate. Mara didn't reply, but her cheeks warmed. She stood, mumbled something about checking on the babies, and left him there on the porch with a half-smile forming on his lips. That night, she dreamt of hands, gentle, steady, brushing hair from her face and tucking a blanket around her shoulders. Not Derek's hands, Julian's. And when she woke, her chest ached not with pain, but possibility. It was during an early morning walk in the garden behind the guest house that the turning point came. The air was crisp, the sky the pale hue of new beginnings. Mara had wrapped the triplets in soft carriers strapped against her chest and side, humming a lullaby as she moved among the flower beds. Julian joined her midway through the walk, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. You always know when to appear, she teased. I'd call it intuition, he replied. They strolled in silence for a while, their steps falling into rhythm. I used to think I didn't deserve good things, she said suddenly. After Derek left, I thought it was my fault, that maybe I wasn't enough, not lovable enough, not strong enough, not useful. Julian stopped walking. That's a lie pain tells you when it wants to keep you small. Mara's eyes welled. Then why does it still feel true some days? He took a step closer. Because healing isn't a straight path. Some days the shadows return, but it doesn't mean the light is gone. She looked up at him, really looked. His eyes were steady, the color of earth after rain, familiar, warm. Julian reached out and gently touched her cheek, not forceful, not possessive, just present. She didn't pull away. I've watched you rise, Mara, not because someone saved you, but because you saved yourself and let someone care. Tears fell silently. For the first time, she didn't wipe them away. She let them trace her skin like baptism, and then she leaned in. Their foreheads met first, breath mingling, neither rushing the moment. The kiss that followed was not urgent, it was reverent, like a vow whispered into the spaces where doubt once lived. When they parted, Mara smiled through her tears. I didn't think I could feel this again. Julian brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. Then let it surprise you. From that day, things shifted between them, not dramatically, not publicly, but in all the little ways that matter. Julian began staying for dinner. Mara started sharing bits of her design work, letting him critique and admire. They laughed more. Sometimes even danced with the babies in their arms when the living room grew too quiet. But Mara remained cautious. Her heart, though healing, was still tender. One evening, while placing Nova into the crib, Julian gently asked, What scares you the most about letting me in? She paused, pulling the blanket up to the baby's chest. That I'll depend on you, and you'll leave. She looked at him, uncertain. I'm not asking for all of you right now, just a little space in your world, a space I'll protect, a space I'll never walk away from. Mara exhaled, her chest rising with both relief and fear. I can try, she said. That's all I need. And so she tried. Each moment they shared became another thread in a new kind of connection, not built on fantasy or grand gestures, but honesty, daily effort, and the quiet joy of being seen. One night, while the house slept, Mara stood in the kitchen sketching by candlelight. Julian walked in, still in slacks and rolled-up sleeves, holding a book he'd found for her. Without a word, he placed the book beside her sketchpad and stood behind her. She leaned back slightly, resting against him. Neither of them said a thing. Because some flames don't roar, they smolder slowly, until suddenly they're everything. It was a peaceful evening, the kind that often follows days of emotional growth. The triplets had finally fallen asleep after a particularly restless day, and Mara sat curled up on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, sketchpad resting against her thighs. Julian was in the kitchen, preparing tea, a subtle melody humming from his lips. Everything felt gentle, safe, but sometimes it's when things feel safest that the ground begins to shift. The scent of lavender oil lingered in the air. A quiet playlist of acoustic piano drifted through the house. Julian walked in, handing her a warm cup. "Chamomile with a touch of honey," he said with a wink. She smiled. "You've been paying attention, always." They sat together in the soft glow of lamplight. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just weighty. Mara flipped through her sketches, occasionally sipping from her mug. Julian watched her from the corner of his eye, a question pressing against the back of his mind. "I've been thinking," he finally said. Mara looked up. "I've never met anyone like you." Her throat tightened. Compliments made her uneasy now. She never knew which ones were sincere and which were scripted. But Julian's words never felt rehearsed. "You don't have to say that," she replied, voice hushed. "I want to," he said, setting his cup down. "But I also need to tell you something." Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've been trying to ignore it, hoping it wouldn't matter. But the truth is, I haven't been completely honest with you." The warmth drained from her face. "What do you mean?" Julian took a breath, steadying himself. "The night I found you, it wasn't entirely by accident." Mara's heart stuttered. "You said you were driving past." "I was," he said quickly. "But I wasn't just coming from a shelter. I'd received an alert through one of the Foundation's emergency contact systems. It was a welfare ping. Someone flagged your address through a digital safety protocol we set up with hospitals. It was anonymous. I didn't know who you were until I got there, but I knew someone was in trouble." Mara stared at him. Her fingers clenched the fabric of her sweater. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to feel like a project." Her voice cracked. "But I was—" "No," he said, his voice fierce with emotion. "You were never a project. You were someone in pain. Someone brave enough to survive what should have broken her. I stayed because I saw you, not because of a system alert." Mara rose from the couch, her tea sloshed in the cup, untouched. "You should have told me. I was afraid it would change everything. It has—" The room filled with a silence that hurt. Julian stood too, but he didn't move toward her. "Please understand. I came into your life through circumstance, yes, but I stayed because I saw your worth, because I wanted to." Mara shook her head, eyes brimming. "All this time, you knew before I even opened the door. I didn't know it was you," he said. "But the moment I saw you, I made a choice, to stay, to help, to care." She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. He took a hesitant step forward. "I didn't manipulate you. I gave you space, support. I never crossed a line, but you carried a truth I didn't get to choose," she said quietly. The words hung between them like fog. Then, as if the night needed punctuation, the fire alarm shrieked. They both startled. Smoke. Mara's eyes went wide as she caught sight of a glowing orange flicker under the kitchen counter. "The stovetop!" Julian shouted. She ran to the nursery, instinct overtaking emotion. Julian grabbed the fire extinguisher, fighting the small blaze while Mara swept the babies into her arms. Minutes later, the fire was out. The smoke began to clear. No one was hurt, but the kitchen bore blackened streaks across the backsplash, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt oil. Julian stood in the wreckage, coughing softly, his shirt damp with sweat. Mara returned, cradling the babies, her face pale. "Everyone okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Good," he breathed, leaning against the wall. But she didn't say another word. The fire hadn't hurt anyone physically, but it had exposed something raw between them, something far more dangerous than a flicker of flame. Later that night, Mara sat on the edge of her bed, the triplets nestled nearby, and let the full weight of Julian's confession sink in. She had started to fall for him, not just in moments of tenderness, but in the trust she had carefully rebuilt in his presence. And now, she didn't know what to believe. The next morning was quiet. Julian didn't stay the night. He left after confirming they were safe, his expression unreadable. Mara moved through the day with an emptiness she hadn't felt since Derek left. Not anger, not betrayal, just confusion, the kind that makes your chest feel hollow. By late afternoon, a knock at the guesthouse door broke the silence. She opened it. Julian stood there, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper, not flashy. Just simple. "I don't want to push you," he said, "but if you'll let me explain everything, really explain, I owe you that much." Mara didn't speak. She stepped aside and he entered. They sat at the table, the same table where he once confessed his past, and she had opened up about her fears. But this time, there was no tea, no smiles, just truth. Julian placed the box in front of her. Before I explain, I want you to have this. She opened it. Inside was a small hardcover book, a journal. But as she flipped through it, her eyes widened. Dozens of pages were filled with notes, letters, reflections, all dated from the day they met to now. I started writing to you, Julian said, because I needed a place to process what I felt, what I saw, what I hoped you'd one day know. Mara read a few lines. Her eyes softened. I wrote down the things I never said aloud, how I admired your strength, how I didn't want to interfere with your healing, how every day you reminded me what grace looks like. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I wanted you to know, he continued, that I never saw you as broken. I saw you as brave, and if you need time to figure out how you feel, I'll wait, because what I feel for you doesn't demand anything. It just hopes. Mara looked at the pages again. Some held sketches, flowers, lullabies, verses. Others held confessions too raw to be spoken. I was terrified, she whispered, not just of what happened, but of letting someone in again. Julian reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. You don't have to let me in completely. Not yet, but if you open the door even just a little, I'll be here. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, I don't know if I can love again the way I once did. Julian nodded. I don't want you to love the way you once did. I want us to discover something new, together. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not resolution, not a fairy tale, but the beginning of something grounded, real, fragile, yes, but real. Days passed, each one folding into the next like pages of a story still being written. The fire, though minor, had marked a turning point, not just for the house, but for Mara. For the first time since the night Derek vanished, she was forced to ask herself a question she had buried beneath survival. Could she believe in love again? She didn't rush to answer. She simply lived the question, letting each moment guide her. Julian, true to his word, didn't press. He gave her space but remained nearby, appearing when she needed him and fading when she didn't. He offered comfort without condition, affection without expectation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the nursery in gold, Mara found herself watching him from the doorway. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, entertaining Orion with a rattle in one hand and a gentle rhythm tapped on the crib rail with the other. His laughter came easily, like someone who hadn't forgotten how to be present. She saw him as himself. She stepped into the room. Julian looked up, surprised. You okay? She nodded, then sat beside him on the floor, shoulder brushing his. I've been thinking, she said softly, about what you said, about not chasing the past but discovering something new. He remained quiet, letting her speak without interruption. I don't want to keep punishing myself for trusting the wrong person, she continued, but I also don't want to rush towards someone just because they seem better. Julian nodded. You shouldn't. She turned to him, her voice steady. But I'm not rushing, I'm waking up. A smile tugged at his lips. I don't have all the answers, she added, but I know I feel something when you're around. Peace, not the kind you force, but the kind that feels earned. He gently took her hand. That's the only kind worth building on, he replied. They sat like that, until the babies dozed, until the last light disappeared behind the trees, and the room swam in the quiet breath of newborn dreams. That night, Mara sketched until her fingers ached. She drew faces, not just of the triplets, but of herself, eyes bright, posture firm. She drew a man, too, not as a savior, but as a partner, standing beside her, both of them gazing outward at something unseen but possible. And when she set the pencil down, she finally exhaled. She was no longer surviving, she was beginning. A week later, Mara woke to soft voices in the kitchen. The smell of baked bread wafted through the air. She padded across the hallway barefoot, rubbing her eyes. Julian stood at the stove, speaking with a woman in her 60s, a petite nurse with silver-streaked hair and gentle eyes. This is Nurse Cameron, Julian said as Mara entered. She helped at one of our maternity shelters years ago. She's here to offer overnight help, if you're open to it. Mara blinked, stunned. You arranged this? I noticed how little sleep you've been getting, and you've given so much of yourself. It's time someone gave back. Mara looked at Cameron, who smiled warmly. No pressure, dear. I'm only here if you'd like an extra set of hands. Mara turned to Julian, moved by the gesture. You keep doing this. Doing what? Giving me room to breathe without ever stepping away. He didn't answer with words. He simply smiled, and in his silence Mara felt understood. That night, with Cameron tending to the babies for a few hours, Mara and Julian sat in the garden under starlight. The sky stretched wide above them, endless and open. I've been afraid to hope, Mara admitted, her fingers loosely intertwined with his. But now I'm afraid not to. She rested her head on his shoulder. You make me want to risk it. The next morning, Mara woke to sunlight streaming across the floorboards. The house was still, peaceful. She rose slowly, walked into the living room, and stopped. There, on the couch, Julian sat asleep, his head tilted back, a blanket haphazardly draped across his chest. In his arms, Soren slept peacefully, a tiny fist curled against Julian's shirt. The sight stole her breath, not because it was grand, but because it was real. She tiptoed closer, and as she reached for Soren, Julian stirred. Hey, he murmured groggily. He had trouble sleeping. I didn't want to wake you. Mara took the baby gently and cradled him against her chest. You didn't have to stay here all night, she said. I wanted to. He sat up fully, rubbing his eyes. You know, there's something I've been meaning to ask. Mara turned. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Her heart skipped. I've been holding on to this, not because I needed to rush you, but because I knew eventually we'd arrive at a moment where it would make sense. He opened the pouch and placed something in her hand. It wasn't a ring. Not yet. It was a locket. Inside, 2 tiny photos. One of the triplets in the hospital crib, the other of Mara on the porch, smiling softly beneath a sky of clouds. Engraved inside were 3 words. Begin again, together. Mara stared at it, speechless. Julian spoke gently. I won't ask you for a promise you're not ready to give. But if there's even a part of you that believes we can write something beautiful from where we've come, then wear this, not as a vow, but as a choice. She closed the locket in her palm and looked up. I'm still scared, she whispered. So am I, he replied. But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's what you do with it. Mara stepped forward, and slowly, carefully, she slipped the chain over her head. It rested near her heart, exactly where it belonged. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling not as pressure, but peace. Then Mara said the one thing Julian had never dared to hope for. I'm ready to see where this goes, with you, with us, with all of it. Julian didn't smile this time. He simply took her face in his hands and kissed her, slow, reverent, and deep with the kind of certainty that doesn't need loud declarations. It just needs truth. A few days later, just before sunrise, Julian left a note on the kitchen counter. Meet me where we first met the sky. Mara followed the trail, through the garden, past the old oak bench, to the hill behind the guest house. The sun had not yet broken over the horizon, but the world was poised for it. Julian stood waiting, dressed in soft gray, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. In his hand was a small box. Mara's chest fluttered. You said you needed time, he began, and I've given it. But I also need you to know something. He stepped forward. I'm not asking you to forget the pain that brought you here. I'm asking you to let it be part of the reason we grow. I love you, not as someone broken, but as someone brave. You changed my life, Mara, and I'd like to spend the rest of mine changing yours too. He opened the box. Inside, a ring, simple, elegant, timeless. Mara's eyes filled. Say yes, he whispered. Not because it fixes anything, but because together we can build something better. The first light of dawn crept over the hill, and in its glow, Mara smiled. Yes, she said, steady and sure. Yes, I'll marry you. The world didn't erupt in applause, but it didn't need to. Because sometimes love doesn't shout. It whispers exactly what the soul was longing to hear. The ring on her finger was modest by the world's standards. No extravagant stones or ornate patterns, but it gleamed with something far more valuable. Trust. And it was that trust that Mara carried with her in the days that followed. They didn't rush to plan a grand ceremony. There were no caterers, no magazines circled in red ink. What they had instead was a rhythm, a harmony forming in the quiet corners of shared space. The guest house, once a temporary shelter, began to hum with permanent joy. Mornings started with soft baby coos and the rustle of sheets as tiny feet kicked against swaddled blankets. Julian became a master of one-handed coffee, pouring while cradling a baby with the other. Mara found herself laughing more, real, full laughter that pushed air from her lungs and warmed her from within. One day, while Nova and Orion napped, Soren refused to settle. Mara rocked him against her chest as Julian fiddled with a half-assembled baby bouncer. Give me 5 minutes, Julian said, holding up a tiny wrench with absolute confidence. 5 minutes? She raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious. Let's call it hopeful. She laughed, and Soren giggled too, perhaps sharing in his mother's rediscovered lightness. Julian didn't fix it in 5 minutes. It took 45, 3 mild expletives, and 2 cups of reheated tea. But when he finally got it working, and Soren bounced with delight, Mara applauded like he'd built an empire. Moments like that weren't flashy. They didn't announce themselves as milestones, but they mattered. As weeks passed, Mara returned to her design work, softly at first. A logo for a friend's boutique, a flyer for a local charity, nothing enormous, but enough to remind her of the fire still inside her. Julian noticed everything. He would quietly frame a draft she discarded, place a note beside her stylus, "This one feels like you." He set up a mini workstation in the sunniest part of the living room, complete with a storage cabinet and soft lighting. "This space is yours," he said one afternoon, after carefully measuring the table height. "But if I'm lucky, you'll let me sit nearby sometimes." Mara smiled as she tested her chair. "You already sit everywhere," she teased. "Yes, but now I'll do it with better posture." They shared a soft kiss, then dove into their respective worlds, him reading up on child development, her sketching a new concept for a storybook cover. They worked side by side, each respecting the other's quiet, each occasionally reaching across for a hand to squeeze. It wasn't perfection, it was partnership. There were moments, of course, when memories returned, uninvited, harsh. One evening, as Mara rocked Nova to sleep, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Her heart dropped. For reasons she couldn't explain, she answered. It was Derek's lawyer, dry, unemotional, direct. "Mr. Redmond is requesting to formally forfeit parental rights. You'll be receiving paperwork." No apology, no inquiry about the children, just a legal closure to a personal betrayal. Mara ended the call and stood frozen for a moment. Nova stirred in her arms. Julian noticed her stillness from across the room and walked over, placing a hand on her back. She didn't speak, didn't need to, he didn't ask. He just stood with her, one arm around her waist, the other brushing Nova's hair with his fingertips. Later that night, when the house was quiet, Mara finally said, "He doesn't want them, not even a question about their health, their names, nothing." Julian looked at her for a long moment before replying. "That's his loss, but they're surrounded by more love than some people find in a lifetime." She nodded slowly, brushing away a tear. "You've given them something no one else ever could," she said, "safety, joy. A man to look up to." Julian held her then, not to shield her from the pain, but to remind her that she didn't have to hold it alone. Soon after, Mara decided to give the guest house a transformation, not just a renovation, but a renewal. Walls that were once pale and impersonal were now alive with color. A mural bloomed across the nursery's far wall, 3 shooting stars trailing across a cobalt sky, their tails brushing a mountain range below. Each star was labeled subtly in delicate gold ink. Nova, Orion, Soren. Julian stared at it in awe the evening she finished. "You made the night sky feel small." She leaned against the doorframe, paintbrush still in hand. "I made it ours." They spent that night celebrating with takeout and slow dancing in the living room while the babies slept. Julian played an old jazz record. Mara rolled her eyes. "You're such a romantic. Only for you," he whispered, spinning her gently under his arm. They didn't speak much that night. The music did it for them. One Saturday morning, Mara suggested a walk into town. It was the first time they'd gone anywhere together as a family. The triplets were packed into a triple stroller Julian had spent hours assembling. They drew smiles and gentle greetings from shopkeepers and passers-by. At a small cafe patio, Mara sipped iced tea while Julian fed Orion from a tiny spoon. An older woman at the next table leaned over, watching the family with a warm smile. "You two make it look easy," she said. Mara exchanged a glance with Julian before responding. "It's not always, but it's worth it." The woman nodded. "The way you look at each other. I can see it. That kind of love isn't ordinary." Mara smiled softly. "No, it's not." After the woman left, Julian looked at Mara. "She's right, you know. About what?" "The way I look at you," she chuckled. "I'll believe it when I see the footage." He reached over, brushing his thumb against her cheek. "I see you, even when you don't see yourself." Her laughter faded into a quiet moment, their eyes locked in gentle understanding. And for the first time since that stormy night months ago, Mara felt completely present in her own life. No ghosts, just growth. That evening, they returned home just as twilight crept over the trees. The babies were fed and asleep in record time, possibly thanks to the fresh air. Mara stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching fireflies drift across the yard. Julian joined her, a cup of cocoa in each hand. "You've given me more than I ever imagined," she said, accepting the cup. "Not just love, but freedom, safety, belonging." "I just reminded you of what was already yours," he replied. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "We never got around to wedding plans," she murmured. "I figured the universe was planning something bigger." Mara tilted her head, intrigued. "Like what?" Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter, not typed, not formal, handwritten, a note from the city, a permit approval. He had purchased a plot of land near the guest house, a space surrounded by wildflowers and old trees, the place they often walked through on quiet mornings. I thought, maybe we build it, he said, together, something that's ours from the ground up. Mara stared at the paper, then at him. Not just a house, she whispered. A home, he said. Tears spilled freely now without shame, and as fireflies flickered around them like tiny lanterns in the dusk, she whispered, yes, but to the future, to a life that began in heartbreak and was now built on laughter, intention, and love. A home not made of bricks, but of every soft moment where healing took root. Autumn arrived not with a chill, but with a promise. Leaves rustled like whispers of the past, letting go so something new could begin. The days grew softer, the air clearer. In the gentle cadence of falling leaves, Mara's life continued to unfold, rich with color, grounded in love. The plot of land Julian secured became a canvas, not for blueprints or construction crews just yet, but for dreaming. They visited the space every weekend, sometimes with coffee in hand and babies strapped to their chests, other times with picnic blankets and sketch pads. Mara would draw visions of open concept rooms filled with light. Julian would make notes in a leather-bound journal, mapping out gardens and quiet reading corners. This is where I want the nursery, she said one morning, pointing toward a hill that caught the morning sun. Julian leaned over her shoulder. You think we'll need it again someday? She paused, then smiled. Maybe. They exchanged a glance, hopeful, teasing. That night, under a sky brushed with stars, they spoke of things that once felt too fragile to imagine. Future birthdays, holiday traditions, vacations with 3 toddlers in tow, and quiet nights spent reading by the fire. They weren't in a hurry. They were building something that would last. Word began to spread in town, not just about Mara and Julian, but about the quiet resilience that had taken root at the edge of the neighborhood. Neighbors stopped by with baby gifts and kind words. Local mothers offered extra blankets and advice. Artists from Mara's old circle reached out, curious to see her work again. She'd become a story, not the kind people whispered behind closed doors, but one that gave others something to believe in. One morning she received a message from a woman named Janelle, a single mother who had followed Mara's small online portfolio. The message was simple. Your strength reminded me not to give up. Mara read it twice, then cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that her survival had become someone else's inspiration. Julian, watching her from across the room, said nothing. He only walked over and wrapped his arms around her. He didn't have to say anything. His silence held space for her joy. Weeks turned to months. The triplets grew fast, each with their own quirks and temperaments. Nova was fierce and curious. She loved sound, anything that hummed or beeped or crinkled in her hands. Orion was gentle, often found resting his head against the crib rail and watching the world in thoughtful silence. And Soren? He was the mischief maker, quick to giggle and quicker to crawl away the moment no one was looking. Their first birthday approached with the speed of a heartbeat. Mara wanted to keep it small, just them, a cake, and a few photos. Julian had other plans. The morning of their birthday, Mara awoke to find the backyard of the guest house transformed. String lights hung from the trees, soft acoustic music played through a discreet speaker, and a long table was set with paper crowns, warm pastries, and a modest but beautifully decorated cake. I told you, Julian said, I don't do anything halfway when it comes to celebrating love. Friends arrived, people from town, old clients who had followed Mara's journey online. Even Nurse Cameron brought a quilt she'd stitched by hand, embroidered with the children's names and the phrase, rooted in love, raised in grace. Mara stood at the edge of the celebration, eyes wide, heart full. Julian came up behind her and whispered, We're not just surviving anymore, Mara. We're thriving. She turned to him, a tear slipping down her cheek. You've made me feel seen, every day. He kissed her temple and replied, You were always visible, you just needed someone who didn't look away. As the seasons changed, so did their pace. Mara's design business blossomed, now supported by a small but loyal team. She accepted commissions sparingly, only when the work inspired her. Julian continued his philanthropic work, expanding his foundation's reach with new initiatives that focused on family care, mental health support, and maternal wellness. Together they built more than a household. They built impact. They took turns. When Mara had long design hours, Julian managed bedtime. When Julian traveled for outreach work, Mara made sure the house pulsed with calm routine. But no matter how busy life became, they preserved one tradition. Sunday evenings were sacred. On On those nights after the triplets were asleep, they sat on the porch with warm drinks, a blanket between them, and no distractions. Just each other. "We used to sit here and dream," Mara said one such evening. "Now we sit here and remember how far we've come." Julian smiled. "We're still dreaming. We just happen to be living part of it already." She leaned against him, their hands entwined. "I want to write it all down someday, not as a fairy tale, but as truth. Because not all happy endings begin with love. Sometimes they begin with loss." He kissed the top of her head. "And sometimes they begin when you least expect them, on a stormy night with a stranger at your door." One morning in late spring, Julian walked into the nursery holding a weathered wooden box. Mara, folding laundry beside the crib, looked up. "What's that?" He opened the lid to reveal slips of paper, dozens of them, yellowed with time. "Letters," he said. "Ones I wrote to my future family long before I ever met you." Mara blinked, stunned. Julian pulled one out and read it aloud. "Dear future little one, I don't know your name, or if I'll ever get to meet you, but I promise, if I do, I will love you with every breath, not because I'm supposed to, but because I want to, because you'll be mine and I'll be yours." Mara reached for his hand. "These were written years ago," he said, "but now I know who they were meant for." Tears lined her lashes. "You've loved us even before you knew we existed." "I've loved the idea of you my entire life," he replied. "And now," she said, "you don't have to imagine anymore." They spent the afternoon reading letter after letter, promises Julian once made to the universe, now fulfilled in the laughter echoing through the halls and the warmth between them. As summer approached, the land they'd dreamed over was finally ready to become something tangible. Construction began, slow, deliberate, filled with intention. Each brick laid was a celebration. Each beam raised was a memory in the making. They visited the site every evening. The triplets would toddle across the foundation, laughing as they navigated the unfamiliar terrain. Mara and Julian would stand side by side, watching them with eyes full of awe. "Do you think they'll remember this?" she asked one night. "Maybe not the details," he said, "but they'll remember the feeling, the safety, the joy. And they'll remember us," she added, "not because we were perfect, but because we showed up. Every single day." Julian kissed her forehead. "That's what love looks like." And it was. Not loud, not flawless, just present, alive in every hug before bedtime, every scraped knee kissed gently, every sunrise met with renewed commitment. They weren't chasing a dream anymore. They were living one, a life built on truth, a family forged in grace, a home rising from the ground, not just as shelter, but as testament to the storms they had endured, to the hearts that dared to hope, to the love that refused to break. It was neither grand nor whispered about in society circles. But to Mara, their wedding day felt like the most profound moment of her life. No cathedral, no tuxedos, no string quartet. Just the backyard of the nearly completed home, a space carved out by intention and devotion. Wildflowers framed the aisle, lanterns swayed in the breeze, and rows of mismatched chairs welcomed those who had walked beside them through sorrow and growth. The sun rested high, its golden warmth casting long shadows across the earth. The triplets, Nova, Orion, and Soren, sat in a pram adorned with ivy and silk ribbons, their curious eyes blinking up at the fluttering canopy above. Mara stood behind the wooden gate that served as an altar entry. Her dress was simple, ivory linen that moved like water, cinched at the waist with a hand-woven belt of soft gold. Her hair, braided back from her face, held 3 small flowers, one for each child. She clutched a bouquet that wasn't just beautiful, it was symbolic. Lilies for rebirth. Eucalyptus for protection, baby's breath for innocence, and tucked within, a single marigold for the strength that had carried her through every breaking point. Julian waited beneath a cedar arch, his suit in muted sand, his stance steady, his expression softened by awe. He didn't just see a bride. He saw the woman who had rebuilt herself without needing permission. The music began, an instrumental arrangement played by a violinist Julian had met through a local nonprofit. As Mara stepped forward, time stilled. Each footstep felt like a declaration. "I am no longer surviving. I am choosing this. I am ready." Julian's breath caught as she approached. Her eyes locked on his, their story suspended in the space between their heartbeats. When she reached him, he whispered, "You look like everything I've ever wanted." And she replied, "You look like everything I never believed could be mine." The ceremony began with silence, intentional and sacred. Then came the words. Not traditional vows recited from memory, but letters, handwritten, sealed, and kept private until that very moment. Julian went first. He unfolded his letters slowly, his fingers trembling. "Mara," he began, "there was a time I thought love was something other people found. People with less baggage, fewer scars. I thought what I carried disqualified me from being chosen. Then I met you. He paused. You didn't just let me see you. You showed me how to stay. You taught me that love is not rescuing, it's witnessing. It's walking alongside someone, even when they're unsure of their next step. I vow to do that for the rest of my life, not because I'm saving you, but because I can't imagine walking this path without your hand in mine. He folded the letter, eyes glistening. Then Mara opened hers. Julian, she said, her voice strong, you met me at my lowest, but you never saw me as weak. You offered kindness without strings, comfort without control. You showed up, and kept showing up. She blinked back tears, glancing toward the triplets. I vow to show up for you, with the same open heart you gave to me. I vow to build, to listen, to forgive, and most of all, to never let the fear of the past drown out the beauty of our now. A hush settled over the space. Then the officiant, a dear friend from Julian's foundation, stepped forward and spoke softly. Do you, Mara? I do, she whispered, before he could finish. And do you, Julian? With all that I am, he answered. When the rings were slipped onto fingers, they were not just symbols, they were reminders of struggle, of endurance, of conscious choice. And when they kissed, the world didn't cheer loudly, it exhaled. The reception was everything they wanted it to be. Beneath soft lights and woven banners, guests toasted with lemonade and rosemary spritz. Children played in the field, music drifted from speakers, and laughter braided itself through the air. You know, she said, leaning into him, there was a time I thought I'd never feel whole again. And now? He asked. I don't just feel whole, she said. I feel seen, loved, free. Their first dance wasn't choreographed. It didn't need to be. It was a memory of porch swings, midnight confessions, and shared breakfasts while holding teething infants. It was every quiet moment they had chosen each other, every unspoken reassurance that they would keep doing so. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the babies were asleep in the nursery of their nearly finished home, Mara and Julian stepped onto the balcony outside their new bedroom. The moon hung high. The stars glittered like promises waiting to be kept. Mara wore a robe wrapped around her like a cocoon. Julian stood beside her, arm draped across her shoulders. This doesn't feel like the end of a story, she murmured. It isn't, he replied. It's the middle, the part where we get to wake up and live the chapters we once feared would never come. She looked out across the trees. Do you think our children will ask how we fell in love? Julian smiled. I hope they do, and I'll tell them it wasn't a sudden fire. It was a quiet spark we protected every single day, until it lit our world. Mara turned toward him, her hand resting on his chest. And I'll tell them that I chose you, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Julian leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And I'll keep choosing you, he whispered, even when we're gray and old and dancing in socks across this same floor. She laughed, then fell quiet. The moment was complete. A promise wrapped in silence, a life shaped by devotion, a future no longer haunted by what was lost, but shaped by all that was found. As they walked back into the house, Mara glanced once more at the moonlit yard, at the wildflowers swaying gently, at the outline of the structure they had built together. And she knew love wasn't about perfection, it was about partnership, not just surviving storms, but learning how to grow gardens in their aftermath. And as she climbed into bed beside the man who had once been a stranger at her door, she rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady rhythm of the life they now shared. The past no longer clung like a shadow. The future didn't feel distant. It was here, wrapped in love, rooted in trust, and sealed, not with promises carved in stone, but with the soft, enduring vow spoken every day through action. I choose you. The home Julian and Mara built rose slowly, brick by thoughtful brick, story by unfolding story. It wasn't just a place to sleep or store belongings. It became a vessel for memory, motion, and meaning. Mornings were no longer rushed or silent. They were filled with the sounds of bare feet on polished wood, soft hums from the kitchen, and the bubbling laughter of toddlers discovering their world one corner at a time. The nursery evolved into a shared space of wonder, where books lay open on plush rugs and walls were lined with framed sketches of animals, stars, and hand-painted words like kindness, joy, and resilience. Mara worked at her desk near a sunlit window, her design studio now officially registered under the name New Roots Creative. What started as a few commissions blossomed into a brand that stood for transformation. Art shaped by lived experience, created with heart. Julian, ever the quiet force, expanded his foundation's initiatives. He partnered with hospitals to support mothers who had experienced abandonment and trauma, naming the new program after the flower that Mara once tucked into her wedding bouquet, Marigold Outreach. The family became known, not for wealth or stature, but for their presence. People noticed how Julian never interrupted when Mara spoke, how Mara greeted neighbors by name and remembered the birthdays of everyone on their street, how their children, curious, energetic, and wildly independent, were always spoken to with patience and love. Their life didn't escape chaos, it embraced it. One Sunday afternoon, Mara and Julian sat under the old oak in the backyard while the Triplets played in a blanket fort nearby. Soren had turned it into a small kingdom, complete with plastic cups for guards and sticks for swords. Nova was drawing maps on scrap paper, planning their next big adventure. Orion sat with a book open on his lap. Though he couldn't yet read, he liked the weight of the pages. Julian poured iced tea into two mismatched glasses. Mara leaned back in her chair, her eyes following the way sunlight danced between the trees. "You ever think about what our legacy will be?" she asked. Julian glanced over. "Often. But I'm not thinking in terms of foundations or endowments," she smiled. "Me neither." They both looked toward the blanket fort. "Our legacy," he said, "will be the way they speak to others when we're not there. The way they offer help without waiting to be asked." Mara nodded. "The way they choose love, even when it's hard." She picked up a nearby sketchpad and traced a lazy line across the top of the page. "Do you remember the night we met?" "I remember the rain," Julian said. "I remember the look in your eyes. You were holding on by a thread, and yet still holding." "I wasn't sure I'd make it," she said softly. He reached over, his fingers brushing hers. "But you did, and you showed up when I needed someone most." Julian squeezed her hand. "No. I showed up because something told me your story wasn't finished. I just didn't expect I'd get to be part of the rest of it." As the Triplets grew, the rhythms of life shifted again. Bedtime stories became more involved, complete with voices, sound effects, and dramatic endings that left Julian half out of breath and Mara doubled over in laughter. Family dinners included conversations about what-if questions from the kids. What if the sky turned green? What if our house had wings? What if love was a color, and we could paint it? Mara always let them answer for themselves. "It would be gold," Orion said one night. "Because gold is strong," Nova disagreed. "No, it's blue. Because blue means calm, like Mama's eyes." Soren, ever the wild card, grinned. "It's glitter." "Because love sparkles." Julian looked across the table at Mara. "Glitter it is." Evenings became sacred rituals of gratitude. Mara started a family journal titled "The Days We Don't Want to Forget." Each night they'd write a short note. Orion found a ladybug and called it his brother. Nova painted a rainbow on the dog's tail. Soren climbed the pantry shelf again. "We need to move the cookies. Simple moments, but etched with meaning." Years passed with quiet grace. The house expanded slightly. One room became a studio for Mara's growing creative team. Another became Julian's reading room. But nothing extravagant. They kept the space humble. Personal. Every year, on the anniversary of their wedding, they returned to the original spot where they said their vows. The cedar arch remained, now overgrown with flowering vines, its wood softened by time. They would sit beneath it, reread their letters, and add one new promise to each other. Mara's promises were often creative. "I promise to learn how to cook your favorite childhood dish, even if it tastes terrible." Julian's were poetic. "I promise to listen, even when the words don't come easily." Their children eventually joined them, placing flowers at the base of the arch, asking questions about the photos framed on the side table nearby. "This is where everything changed," Mara would say, brushing a hand over her locket. "This is where we decided to begin again." And with each year those beginnings multiplied. Not because their life lacked difficulty, but because they never stopped choosing each other. One evening, when the children were fast asleep and the crickets hummed outside, Mara found Julian in the reading room, sitting in his chair with a worn book in hand. She slid beside him, curling up against his chest. "Now I know. It's about holding joy and pain in the same palm, and still reaching forward." He looked at her then, truly looked. "That's the most beautiful thing you've ever said." She smiled. "I've had good inspiration." Julian closed the book and held her close. "We'll teach them that, won't we? That life is meant to be felt deeply, all of it." "Yes," she said. "And that love isn't a moment. It's a muscle. You work at it. You stretch it. You honor it." They sat in the stillness, the kind of quiet that only comes from two people who no longer need to fill space with sound. Their fingers intertwined, their breathing steady, their future unfolding. By the time the children turned 10, Mara had filled 4 volumes of the family journal. Some entries were short, others long, some joyful, others written through tears. But all of them held one common thread: presence. At the back of the 4th volume, Mara added a letter titled, "For When We're Gone." It read, "If you're reading this, it means the time has come for you to carry this love forward. We may no longer walk beside you, but we've left pieces of ourselves everywhere, in the way the floor creaks outside the kitchen, in the paint smudges on the hallway door, in the bedtime stories half finished. Love doesn't end, it transfers. So give it freely, hold it gently, and never be afraid to begin again. With all that we were, your parents. When she showed it to Julian, he didn't say a word. He simply placed his hand over hers and nodded. They didn't need to discuss legacy anymore. In the final days of spring that year, as they stood together on their porch watching the sky fade into lavender, Julian whispered, "This is the life I never knew I needed." Mara leaned against him. "And the life I never thought I deserved." He kissed the top of her head. "We're proof that even shattered stories can grow roots, that even after loss, love finds a way." She smiled, the locket around her neck catching the last light of day. Inside it, those same 3 words, "Begin again, together." Years later, long after the triplets had grown into young adults and the once bustling nursery echoed only with memory, Mara sat on the same back porch where so many of life's defining moments had unfolded. She was older now. Her hair held threads of silver, her hands bore the soft lines of time, yet her spirit, steady, resilient, unmistakably radiant, remained untouched by age. The garden before her was blooming wildly. Rows of tulips, sunflowers, and heirloom herbs stretched toward the sky. At the far end, the old cedar arch still stood, now wrapped entirely in flowering vines. Every few days, neighbors would stroll by just to glimpse it. Some came to ask how it had stayed standing so long. Others came to feel what lingered there, a peace that couldn't be explained, only experienced. Inside the house, echoes of laughter still lived in the walls. Faint handprints on the doorframe had never been wiped away. The framed drawings of Nova's first rainbow, Orion's first book, and Soren's self-portrait, made with buttons and glue, still hung in the hallway. Nothing was staged. Everything was cherished. Julian had passed just after their 50th anniversary, not suddenly but peacefully, at home, in her arms. His last words had been a whisper, yet carried more weight than any speech he'd ever given. "You were my beginning, and my greatest choice." She had kissed his cheek, held his hand until the final breath left him, and watched the morning light spill across the room like a benediction. He didn't need to say more. They had spent a lifetime saying everything that mattered. After his burial, under the oak tree they had once danced beneath, Mara retreated inward for a while. Not in despair, but in reverence. She spent the first months rearranging the house, not to erase his presence, but to feel closer to it. She moved his favorite chair near her sketch table, placed his mug beside her teacups, and draped one of his old scarves across the coat rack at the front door. The space didn't feel empty. It felt paused, like a book you set down only to savor the weight of every page. Their children visited often. All 3 now carried bits of their father's calm and their mother's courage. Nova had become an educator, Orion a musician, and Soren, true to form, a traveling writer who sent postcards from every city he visited. Each one signed, "Still chasing love the way you both taught me to." One spring morning, as Mara sipped her tea and flipped through an old journal, she came across a page she didn't remember writing. The ink was faded, but legible. "If I ever forget how we got here, remind me it wasn't through certainty. It was through choice, repeated daily, in silence, in storms, in folding laundry, holding hands and watching the stars without needing to speak." She traced the lines with her fingertip. Then she turned the page and added a final note. "We chose each other in every season, and that is how we built our forever." She closed the journal, exhaled slowly, and glanced at the ring on her finger. Still there. Still meaningful. That afternoon, she walked to the old cedar arch. The vines now shimmered with fresh blooms, white jasmine, wild roses, and a few forget-me-nots that had returned without prompting. Beneath it sat a wooden bench Julian had crafted by hand in his final years. The initials M+J were etched into its side, barely visible now, softened by the elements. Around her, the breeze moved gently. In it, she imagined his voice. Not loud, not mystical, just present, not a goodbye. But a presence that never really left, and in that moment she felt it again. Not just love, but the quiet eternity of it. The kind that doesn't need reminders, anniversaries, or declarations. The kind that lives on in how you speak to others, in the patience you show your children, in the way you hold someone's hand without needing a reason. Mara smiled softly, then leaned back on the bench, face lifted to the sky, whispering the same words she'd said every year since that morning he proposed with 3 swaddled babies beside him. "Yes, I still choose you," and the wind answered not with words, but with peace. "Before you go, I want to ask you something from the heart. Have you ever felt like life gave you a second chance when you least expected it? Have you ever watched someone walk away, only to find someone better waiting just beyond the heartbreak? If Mara and Julian's story touched something deep in you, if it reminded you that love can return stronger, softer, and more sacred than ever before, then don't just keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, have you ever experienced a love that healed you, or are you still waiting on your own Julian moment? If this story made you feel something, hope, healing, or even just a tear you didn't expect, please give it a like. It tells the platform you want more stories just like this. And most of all, subscribe. Because every week, we share stories that remind you it's never too late to begin again. Not in love, not in life, not in purpose. Thank you for being here. You're not just a viewer, you're part of this storytelling family now. And I'm so glad you stayed to the end. Until next time, keep believing in love.